We're going.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Our mics are plugged in.
They should be.
Hopefully you can hear us. This is Two Beers in a Bible. I'm John Swano.
I'm Dave Tenney.
And we're glad you're with us. Today we are... Where did you
We're at Dave's house today.
We are at Dave's house. Notice the different environs. Today we are looking into the book of Matthew, right?
Yep, Matthew
19.
Last episode we talked about marriage and divorce, and I think we've talked about it in a couple episodes.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing we didn't talk about last week was these couple of verses here, verses 11 and 12, where Jesus kind of talks about celibacy. And it's just a few verses, and then we're going to also, after we kind of talk about that, we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And Paul has some commentary, I think verse 7 in that comment has a commentary on this, but that whole section just talks about marriage. Mm-hmm. So I guess we'll talk about marriage again this episode, sort of.
Looks like it.
Yeah, it looks like that's what we're going to do. So you want to read 11 and 12?
Yeah. Chapter 19, starting at verse 11. But he said to them, all cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. And the statement, this is coming off of, when we were talking about divorce and remarriage and
his
and
disciples.
all the pitfalls there.
Yeah, and then his disciples asked him and said, if such is the case, so when Jesus teaches about divorce and remarriage, and he says, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry. That's what the disciples came to the conclusion of. And Jesus, then he says, and then he starts talking about eunuchs. And what's the idea of a eunuch? I'll let you answer the complicated question, Dad.
Well, basically, a person that is unable to, for whatever means, whether it be physical. I think it's primarily going to be physically that they cannot take part in, sexual activities.
Yes, exactly.
You put that delicately.
Yeah, so that's why I think he talks about three different kinds of eunuchs there.
Yeah.
He talks about eunuchs who were born that way, and that still happens. There are people that have been born without sexual organs. And then, of course, I think the more common one is the ones that were made eunuchs by men. And I always think about Esther, where the guards of the women's area were eunuchs.
Right.
And then, of course, you think about the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got those who have made themselves eunuchs, and I think that's more of a mental.
Yeah, maybe. But regardless, it's in dealing with such a thing, if you take that part out of a man, they kind of have a little bit more brain power to focus on the Lord.
You would think. You would think.
It takes away that distraction.
Yeah.
Is the point that I guess is being made there. And God, of course, gave us marriage, so it's not that everyone is to be that way.
I mean, he told us to be fruitful and multiply.
Right.
In Genesis
Absolutely.
chapter 1 and verse 28, I believe.
But for various reasons, people had become eunuchs, and
I mean, so he gives this advice that there are some, if you're able to accept this, then it's a good thing.
Right, because it leaves
more
of your brain to focus on godly things.
So that being said, let's go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And in here, Paul has some commentary about marriage. So last week we talked about divorce. And of course, that's not a good thing. And so this is good because it gives us some instructions on how to stay married. And marriage. There's always problems in a marriage. No marriage is perfect except for John's.
Yeah.
If you can't live with somebody else, if and not have disagreements and not have some problems,
Right.
it's not. I remember when I was a kid, I used to think, man, our family is supposed to be like the Brady Bunch, but we weren't. And I always thought, a good family is like the Brady Bunch, but later on you realize that that's a fantasy.
Right.
So.
I was telling Angela last night. She usually goes to bed before I do, and when I get into the bed, I can't. This is strange. I don't understand why I am this way, but I can't have any wrinkles in the sheets, and they have to be like square and straight. And I peel the corner of the covers back, in a certain way and slide in, and that's just, I've always been that way. And Angela gets in, and it doesn't matter. As long as she's covered, she's covered.
Yeah.
And I'm like, how can you sleep like that? Like, how can you be comfortable with all those wrinkles? So that's one of the differences.
Yes, absolutely.
And she puts up with me in my straight sheets.
Yeah. If you didn't argue,
Right.
then somebody's lying.
Right.
Because you can't agree on every single thing.
Right.
So let's read this. I'll read the first 9 verses. We'll talk about that, and then you read the last, 10 through 16, the last 6 or 7 verses. So Paul writes, he says, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." So I think that comments on what we were talking about in Matthew chapter 19. He says, "Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife. Let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due to her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." So he's talking a lot here about this. This is a lot about the sexual relationships between husbands and wives. I think it addresses most of those things.
You go to, as is common in the news world, they'll take a little snippet and put it out of context. In there. And if you take verse 4, we can really rile some people up if we just read verse 4 there. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does.
Right.
Finish that verse, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So there's a balance there.
Yeah.
And that's the whole purpose, of marriage that God instituted, was that there is to be a balance, and the husband has his job and his duty, and the wife has her job and her duty in the relationship, and they're equal in nearly every way.
Yeah. It's Jesus talked about, when he talked about divorce, he said let a man leaves his mother and father and cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. Mm-hmm. And I think it's Paul's saying basically the same thing.
Yeah.
When he talks about that your wife has authority over you and you have authority over your wife, right? It's because you're supposed to be one unit.
Yeah. We're working in the same direction, and we see how detrimental it is when people do not work in the same direction.
Yep.
If they spend, I know that people that have jobs that that take them away for long hours and days have trouble moving as one unit with their spouse. Or
Yes.
if one is more self-willed and wants to do what they want to do and hasn't grown up to the
Yeah.
point where they can work together with another person, then probably they probably fit into that category. It'd be better if they didn't get married.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so he talks about that, and he talks about because of sexual immorality. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and the reason, and I think he's just speaking to the fact that I don't know of a polite way to put this, but some people are more. A sexual relationship is something that they desire more than other people do. I think
Right.
that's kind of what he's getting at.
Right, and
I mean,
and there's nothing wrong with it because God instituted it. He made that as a part of His creation
Yep.
of man.
Without it, there would be no human race.
Right.
Right.
And God has allowed a way in which that can be fulfilled.
Yeah.
In a way that is pleasing in His sight.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then he talks about the unmarried and to widows, and he says it's good. It's good for them to remain unmarried, and I think you talked about that earlier about the idea that they could devote themselves more to God. Well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But just because it's good, he's not commanding that.
Right.
What about you think about some religious groups?
Mm-hmm.
I think about the Catholic Church to where priests and nuns never marry.
Mm-hmm.
And
I just have to point to current recent events, and you see the fruits of such a decision.
Yeah.
When you differ from what the scriptures say, and you bind something that the scriptures haven't bound, you're going to have trouble. And therein is the fruit of that decision, is what we have seen come out in the past 10, 15 years or whatever.
It's a burden that some just. That's why he talks about burning with passion. It's a burden some of us just couldn't carry.
Right.
And I would be one of those. I mean,
right.
I could not do what Paul did.
Right.
But
Yeah. I had the privilege of preaching a funeral just yesterday for a lady, and this lady that passed away, a sister in Christ, her and her husband, they had each been married. This was their third marriage. They had each had faithful relationships. Each of their spouses were Christians, but had passed away.
Wow.
Before them, and these two are well advanced in years, and in thinking about that, this is exactly what we're talking about. They found it better, that they needed the companionship and the help along the way, and we know that Christ speaks as a wife, especially a spouse, being a helpmeet.
Yeah. Yep.
Someone who is able to meet the needs of each other.
Yeah.
And that's
a
beautiful thing.
Last night, John stopped over at the house last night. Usually, Monday nights, his kids have Boy Scouts, his boys do. And he always stops over for about an hour and we chew the fat.
Mm-hmm.
But we were talking about being alone.
Mm-hmm.
And how it doesn't bug you that much.
Yeah.
And it drives me crazy.
It would bug me after a while. If I were alone, I would probably have to go sit at the coffee shop.
Yeah.
Yep. Have people around me. But yes, I can be alone for a while and not be bothered by it.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go ahead and you want to read 10 through 16. 1 Corinthians 7, 10 through 16.
All right, starting at verse 10. Now to the married, I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife, but to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. Did I read far enough? Did you want me to go further?
Go read the next two.
But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife?
Okay. So, I mean, there's some pretty heavy stuff. I don't think we'll get real deep into a lot of these issues, but, I think that the basic things I think about is, first off, in the first couple of verses, where he talks about a wife is not to depart from her husband or a husband from her wife, that, that they're to be reconciled to each other. And when we get into these, arguments about what's a scriptural reason for divorce, well, if you listen to our last episode, it's adultery. That's the only reason for divorce. But we know that there are other situations that people get in, like, abuse and all different sorts of things. They're not scriptural reasons for a divorce, but here's some commentary on that. So he says, if she does depart, so, things are so bad at home she can't stay there, he says, let her remain unmarried or to be reconciled to her husband, and it'd be the same way vice versa.
Yeah, and this is speaking to the church at Corinth, and perhaps some of these people coming out of the Jewish religion or otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that spouse might not have agreed with their decision, and yet here we have an example of the scriptures telling them to stay together if they can.
Yeah.
And it also speaks to the fact that the marriage law usurps pretty much everything else. When you come to the repentance and you come to believe that Christ is who he says he is, you become obedient to the gospel, you're buried in the waters of baptism, having repented from your sins. If you were married not according to the law of the Lord, yet you repent, and you can't look at that sinful marriage as something that you just, okay, now I'm washed clean and I can continue in that sin.
Right.
So it speaks to the fact that the marriage law usurps whether or not you're in the church or not. If two people are to be married, whether they're Christians or not, they fall under the marriage law.
They do.
Of the Lord.
Absolutely. Then he talks about unbelieving wife or unbelieving husband, and of course you might get in a situation where, you marry somebody, you're married and you become a Christian, and then your spouse is like, oh, I don't like this,
Mm-hmm.
and they leave. Well, I mean, that can happen, but if they decide not to leave and they stay with you, then that's a good thing.
Right.
And he talked about them sanctifying their spouse. Mm-hmm. And I guess I know sanctified means to be setting apart, mm-hmm. or making holy. I'm not sure what that means in that context.
Right. I think it speaks to them being allowable in the eyes of God.
Yeah.
Yeah,
probably. Yeah,
without getting
too deep,
digging too deep. That might be another whole lesson in itself. But in thinking about that, you think about how many times I know that you know people that this has happened to, that they were able to convert their spouse.
Oh yeah,
I can think of numerous elders in the church over the years that started out by marrying their wives, and they weren't Christians,
right?
When they met them, or possibly even after they got married, and it was the wife who was really strong in the faith that was able to convert them, and really help them along the way to becoming a very solid Christian.
Yeah, absolutely, and that happens for sure.
It happens a lot.
Yeah, so I think it speaks to all of those things.
Yes.
Yeah,
and to just to throw out another controversial type comment, maybe is that when you think about people that would bash the church and the scriptures and say that it's anti-woman,
Right.
That is just the farthest thing from the case.
It's absolutely.
And it is so clear when you see some of the very strong Christian women that I know, that you and I know, and how they've been able to be so instrumental in shaping their family into what they are.
Absolutely. Yeah, a mutual friend of ours always tells a story about his grandmother, who basically straightened the whole family out.
Right.
And that happens. That can happen.
Yeah.
Now, does the Bible talk about different roles for men and women?
Yeah, absolutely.
It does, but really it's all in worship.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's what it's all directed at.
Right. Yeah, and in the marriage relationship, I mean, there's no doubt that after in the garden that God had told Eve that she was going to be subject to her husband.
Right.
But
yeah.
But nonetheless,
stick your chest out, John.
No. But nonetheless, that again, and that's qualified here in what we just read about what that means.
Yes.
And yes, the authority as far as teaching and preaching in the church has been given to the man.
Yeah.
And just you wrap your head around that. I mean, who was it that led the charge to sin in the garden?
It was Eve.
Right. And I know that might get us some thumbs down, but it's the truth.
Yeah, that's the truth.
It's just what it is.
It is what it is.
And that's how God made the decision then, and it's not me or you telling people that that's the way it is.
I can't believe you made me answer that question. What kind of friend are you?
Your wife's just in the other room.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about that. But husbands are supposed to be willing to sacrifice ourselves for our wives, just like Christ did for the church.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of things that go along with that.
It is not as cut and dry as just a few statements. And
no,
there's a whole context to the idea of what it means to be a follower of Christ, and what it means to be a godly spouse. That leads into that, and I don't know anybody that is, and I'm talking about truly faithful Christians, not the ones that not people that just show up and put on a good show on Sunday, but those that I truly know and believe to be faithful, that don't have a wonderful marriage.
Yeah,
if you follow God and His precepts, and you are both seeking in that direction, I mean, you can't lose.
Right. Yeah, it's there are these instructions for women about being submissive, but there are these instructions for husbands about being, a sacrifice, and putting your wife first.
It never really does it say to run in the room, grab them by their hair, and drag them out the door.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not the caveman mentality.
Yeah, or throw things when dinner isn't served the right way.
Absolutely.
You make dinner. I made dinner tonight.
Yeah.
Make dinner yourself.
Me too.
You lazy bum. Yeah, exactly.
I made dinner tonight.
Yeah, what'd you make?
Well, BLT sandwiches.
Oh, man.
It's Jonathan and I tag team made dinner, so I didn't do it all.
We made potato soup, but I made the kids peel all the tomatoes.
No,
potatoes. Not tomatoes.
Potatoes.
I do like tomato soup, too. Well, John, I know we're only at about, what are we at, about 24, 25 minutes.
The camera's farther away from
Yeah,
us
it is.
than normal.
I don't know if we have time to get anything else for this episode.
Okay.
But, well, you know what? Yeah, let's go back to chapter 19, and we can talk about Jesus blessing the children.
Alrighty.
That ought to wrap us up. It's only 2 verses. Matthew 19, verse 13. He says, Then little children were brought to him, that he might put his hands on them and pray, but the disciples rebuked them. But Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." And he laid his hands on them, and he departed from there.
Mm-hmm.
I find this, these apostles are really thick. The reason I say that is in the previous chapter, so chapter 18, in verse 3, Jesus says, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven."
Yeah. Yeah, and it speaks to the innocence of children and the inquisitiveness of children, I believe, too. You think of a child asking 100 questions. Why this and why that? That's what the Lord wants of his people, is that we would be inquisitive enough to want to know more about him.
Yes.
And not be satisfied with the words that we hear from the preacher on Sunday, and perhaps a little bit on the radio, or whatever it might be. The idea is that we would want to go and learn and know more.
I think, and you also, if you ever had little kids, which John and I both have, but there's just this innocence with kids, and that's all wrapped up in this too.
Yeah.
And we've got to have that as well. This innocence, or this, I don't want to say being ignorant of sin, but kind of. Mm-hmm. We need to be not sinning.
Yeah.
And if you think about children, do children do things wrong?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think they consciously do it.
And it comes to, the Lord speaks of conscience, and speaks of, to him that knows it is sin, it is sin.
Yes.
And as we think about our children, at some point they come to realize, okay, this is not something I should be doing.
Right. And
that's when you really get into the punishment phase, if you will, of reprimanding them, is when they, as one of my children was especially good at, of kind of looking at you out of the corner of their eye and saying, "Watch what I'm going to do."
Yeah.
And that's when the hammer comes down.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing that God expects of us.
Now, does Anderson still do that?
No. Not nearly as often, almost never.
Oh, that's funny. Well, John, I guess we'll close it up there.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining in. We hope that it was interesting, and hope that it was something that you can learn from. I know we, as we say just about every week, we learn together here as we do this. So thanks for joining in. Like, subscribe, whatever the format is. However it is on
whatever you do it.
Yep, do that thing. Right. And we'll see you next time.
Come on.